welcome to another episode of Pastatime with the Scariest Podcast.
Woo!
I'm Robin Grace, this is Adam Diaz.
Hello.
And Pastatimes are where we get to read creepypastas and fictional pastime, or creepypasta stories that are written by you guys.
Indeed. We are going to have one story that was submitted to us by a wonderful spooky friend, so thank you. I believe that'll probably be the last one reread. Aside from that, we're going to be reread? I said reread.
Yeah.
That said, we're going to be reading some creepypastas that are just straight up creepypastas written by folks that we don't know. Very excited to go through those as well. If you have a suggestion for a story, actually one of the ones that we're going to read, the first one in fact, was suggested to us by a spooky friend. They sent it directly to our email. They said, I love this one. I would love to see it on the show. So I grabbed that one too. So if you have a suggestion for a creepypasta or an SCP that you would like to see, or if you have your own that you have written, please feel free to email pastatime@scariest.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to put it on the show if you are comfortable having it on the show. So fun stuff. I really like Pastatime episodes. Really excited to be doing it again. And I guess I can just go ahead and jump into my first one.
Yeah.
All right, so
You go, Grr.
This one was sent to us by the username ASMR Slime Fun, and it's called The Expressionless. And they made sure to let us know that this one is not theirs. It's just one of their favorite ones off of a wiki that they found. So let's go ahead and jump into it. It's relatively short, and then we both have ones that are going to be long as well. It starts out like this. According to the story, a nameless woman arrived to the Cedars-Sinai Hospital in June 1972 wearing a bloodied white gown. Well, this was not surprising given how many injured and sickly people come to the hospital each day.
And I'm sure they look much worse.
What set the woman apart from the other patients was that she had a mannequin-like appearance and yet moved fluently like any normal human. Her face was also devoid of certain facial features such as eyebrows and was smeared with makeup. For no discernible reason, the nameless woman had a kitten in her mouth, which she pulled out before collapsing to the ground. Okay.
What?
This one's rich in plot and also really fucking weird so far.
It seems like an alien trying to look human and doesn't know what to eat, so they eat kittens.
Everyone eats cats, right? Anyways, this is
Wonderwall.
probably where they got the idea for the show Alf from. So, all right, I'm going to keep going. The woman is taken into one of the rooms and is thoroughly cleaned in preparation for sedation. Fearing for the worst, the staff decided it be best to restrain her until the authorities arrived, but they are also too frightened to look directly at the woman. They explained to her what their injections were for, and she seemed to be following along without much repercussion. When the chief doctor was preparing to inject her, however, the woman immediately started fighting back. 2 staff members tried to hold her back as her body rose up from the medical bed. The woman then did something strange and smiled at the head doctor when he asked her what she was.
Wow.
Her smile was immensely disturbing as she had rows of razor-sharp teeth that seemingly were impossible to fit into her mouth.
Melina.
The doctor turned his back to the woman when he heard the authorities arrive, which gave the woman the chance to strike. The woman darted at the head doctor and sunk her teeth firmly into his neck, severing his jugular. As he lay dying, the woman leapt over him, proclaiming that she was God. The authorities arrived to the scene of the crowd and tried to overpower her, but the nameless woman ended up massacring everything she came across. A surviving nurse, surviving nurse means not everything she came across. A surviving nurse of the attack named the unknown woman the Expressionless. There had never been another sighting of that woman since that incident. And that's the whole thing. That's the Expressionless. So pretty short, I will say. I actually saw this one passed around a little bit on different forums that I've seen.
I did see. There's like a picture, right? Of this.
It looks like a mannequin in a hospital bed. Yeah, there's totally
and they're
a picture
trying to
of
like
this.
put her into the bed or something, or force her down on
It's
a bed.
very creepy. It absolutely is. I will say the story was a lot shorter than I thought it would be. And I thought there'd be like way more leading up to like people hiding from the creature, but that said, you'll definitely be getting some of that in the later ones because I picked one that was also really creepy and about some like bizarre happenstance. So
cool.
Thank you so much to ASMR Slime Fun for sending us that one. We appreciate it.
Sounds like an Instagram channel where they just like cut the soap.
Yeah.
Or no, that's ASMR. No, that's
ASMR.
I
mean, if you're listening to it.
Oh, because you can hear the
audio pleasures.
Yeah.
It was like, because that's what it sounds like. Then yeah. So, okay, good stuff.
I'm going to head into my first creepypasta, and it is titled Decay, and I'm sure a lot of you folks have heard this one before. I never have, so it's exciting for me. Alright, so it goes. Am I going to die? The kid asked me as he was being rolled into the operating theater. It was a question I'd heard 1,000 times before, but answering it truthfully hadn't become any easier, even after years at the hospital. Of course not. We're gonna fix you right up, I lied. Oh, God.
Jesus, starting out strong.
Right? He'd been crushed in a horrific car accident, and though we would put all our effort into saving his life, hope was a limited resource. The fact that he even remained conscious despite losing most of his blood was bizarre enough, but after 10 years on the job, nothing surprised me anymore. The anesthesiologist quickly put him under while we scrubbed in for surgery. Damien would be the surgeon, a specialist in polytrauma cases, and I'd assist. No sooner had we opened him up before we shared a look of disappointment. There was no chance in hell he'd survive through surgery. Despite our lack of faith, we tried our best, but after only half an hour on the table, his heart gave out. How is he still alive when he arrived? Damien asked. He pronounced the time of death and left us to clean up the mess. I took the responsibility of cleaning the kid up for the morgue, a task I'd committed to countless times before. It wasn't something I personally enjoyed, but to me, it was my final chance to pay respect to the dead. The kid couldn't have been more than 15, and as I'd hear, he was just learning to drive. Unexperienced at attempting his first drive on a slippery road, he managed to steer off into a ditch. His father died on impact, but he himself lived long enough to face surgery. As I put the needle to his open abdomen, his body twitched for a moment. I retracted the needle in surprise, wondering what had caused a post-mortem spasm. Then the boy suddenly gasped for air as his eyes shot open. He let out the most violent scream imaginable as he suddenly returned to life. "Help me," he begged with a guttural voice as I stumbled back in panic and slipped onto the floor. I called for help and the rest of the team came running into the operating theater, each panicking as they witnessed the dead boy scream on the operating table. His spine was fractured, so though he yelled in agony, he could do nothing to move. The anesthesiologist quickly attempted to sedate him while we checked his vitals. Despite all evidence pointing to the contrary, his heart had not started beating again.
This reminds me of Death Becomes Her, but way creepier.
He was supposed to be dead. I started chest compressions, desperately trying to get his heart going. I cringed at the sound of his ribs cracking beneath my hands, and the boy's screams turned to gargles as he was unable to gasp for another breath. "He's not going under," the anesthesiologist yelled as he gave the kid a second dose of propofol. Of course, without a functioning heart, there'd be no way for the drug to flow through his veins, even as I tried my best to pump for him. After an hour of compressions, the chief of surgery had intervened and ordered us to stop. At that point, we caused more damage than we helped. "What's happening to me?" the kid said, still conscious. None of us responded. We couldn't find any words to describe the horrific sight before us. Most of the staff had left due to the sight. We'd faced many challenges in our career, but nothing quite like this. "What's your name?" I asked, despite having already seen it in the file. I just wanted him to focus. "Brian Dawson," he responded. I took a deep breath, doing my best to keep my composure. "You were in an accident, Brian," I told him. His eyes darted frantically around the room as he started to realize where he was. He tried to lift his neck, but due to the spinal fracture, he was completely paralyzed. "I can't move. I can't move," he cried. I walked closer, standing directly above him. "Brian, your heart isn't beating," I said. The chief of surgery, George, grabbed me by the shoulder and whispered into my ear. "We need to isolate the OR. Whatever is happening here is beyond us, and it could be contagious," George said. He rushed into the preparation room, picked up the phone. Through the glass door, I couldn't hear what he said, but I assumed he was calling security to shut down the ward. "Well, what about my father?" Brian asked, trying to hold back tears. I was taken aback by his question. I just told him his heart was destroyed and that it was essentially dead. Yet his first concern was regarding his father. "I'm sorry, Brian. He died on impact." He sobbed quietly. "So what's going to happen to me? I'm going to die, aren't I?" he asked. I didn't know what to say. I'd never been in any similar situations, so I just gave the only answer I thought might be of some comfort. "You're not alone. I'm staying here until the end." George had been quick to shut down the operating theater, and the Center for Disease Control had long since been alerted to our situation. We had nothing to do but wait and pray to any god that Brian wasn't contagious. I'd already been exposed, so I examined Brian, checking for any chance of improving his situation. "Can you feel this?" I asked as I checked all his limbs. "Not a thing," he responded, "but it hurts so much on the inside." "Where exactly does it hurt?" I asked. "Everywhere. Please do something," he begged. I gave Brian a dose of fentanyl, but without a heartbeat to move the drug around, I had little hope it would take any effect at all. To keep him distracted from the pain, I asked mundane things about life, what his hobbies were, family stuff. He was smart enough to realize my intentions, but went along with it either out of fear or because he actually hoped someone could save him. Hours passed while we waited for someone to tell us what to do. Half the surgical staff had been put into quarantine, terrified that they might be infected. Finally, the CDC arrived on scene, fully geared in hazmat suits. They allowed us to roll Brian into his own space. A pre-operation room had been evacuated so he could stay somewhat comfortable. The rest of us would be put into the surgical office while the situation was being assessed. I decided to stay with Brian. No one should have to suffer alone, especially with the CDC agents probing him with all sorts of needles, enthusiastically taking samples. The only reason they allowed me to stay was because I kept him relatively calm. We talked through the night. After the procedures were finished, I couldn't sleep, and I doubt Brian was physically capable of it. "My eyes feel a bit weird," he said. "Do they hurt?" "No, the edges are just kind of blurry. It's weird." I left to go talk to George, who was still working around the clock, calling around, making sure the other patients were redirected elsewhere. "What if we put the kid on a heart-lung machine?" I asked. George put the phone down for a moment and sighed. "Then what? He has no functioning liver, his aorta is cut into pieces, and his intestines are shredded. Even if we got him a new heart, he'd never survive. Just keep him company while you can." I knew he was right, but some of my professional knowledge was put aside due to the insane nature of the situation. "Doctor!" Brian shouted. I rushed to his side. I can't see," he stuttered. I pulled out a flashlight and examined his eyes. Both pupils were unresponsive, and his eyes had started to almost deflate, which was one of the stages of decomposition. Brian had started to rot. "Please, I'm scared." Brian was a brave kid, but he started to lose his composure just like everyone else in the ward. I kept talking to him, but the inevitable truth was that if he kept decomposing, he'd soon lose all his senses, all the while being conscious to experience it. As horrible as it might sound, I begged that it might finally allow him to pass on. We kept talking. I asked him if there's anyone he wanted to call, but as I already knew from the others, Brian's mother had died during childbirth, and his father had been in the same accident as himself. As we talked, Brian's voice kept getting louder, as if he was struggling to hear. "Are you hearing me all right?" I asked. "What'd you say?" Brian basically yelled. His hearing had deteriorated within minutes, going from impaired to deafness before I could even begin to help. With him being blind and deaf, we no longer had a way of communicating, no matter my attempts. I couldn't comfort the dying kid, and the CDC quickly decided that my presence had become unnecessary. Brian kept screaming in terror and agony after I left. For each passing second, his own body started digesting itself, and nothing we could do would make the pain go away. By the morning, his screams had silenced. I barged into the room, much to the dismay of the agents. Brian was hooked up to hundreds of cables monitoring his heart, brain, muscles, and vital values. Of course, his heart showed no activity, and the decay had progressed to shut down all his muscles. He had quieted down, not because the pain was gone, but because he wasn't able to scream anymore. The only part of his body still working was his brain. "What the hell happened?" I asked. "Get him out of here," one of the men demanded. The other man complied, but went outside with me to explain the situation. "You don't have to worry about it being contagious. We'll lift the quarantine in a moment," he said. He looked weirdly somber as he spoke those words. "What about Brian? What'll happen to him?" "He's still conscious, but he has no respiratory function anymore, so we have no means of communicating." Brian was still alive, blind, deaf, and dumb. He had to suffer in loneliness, unable to die. "How long does he have to suffer?" I asked. "We'll know more when we move him to our specialized facility." The senior CDC agent demanded that his colleague kept quiet before they could tell me anything else. They left with Brian, covered him in an airtight capsule so no one would see the horrors that had just occurred within our surgical ward. That's crazy that it's like, we're putting him in an airtight capsule because he can't breathe anymore.
Right.
As soon as the quarantine was lifted, I headed home to write up my letter of resignation. I had a well-connected contact within the CDC, but upon trying to get more information, he claimed no such case had even been presented to them, that no one had ever been admitted to their facility under the name of Brian Dawson. About a month later, a lawyer, accompanied by a doctor, showed up at my door with a bunch of documents, all regarding doctor-patient confidentiality. The lawyer looked tired, worked down to the bone, as if he'd made many such trips before. He asked me to sign the documents and to never speak of this again, saying I'd lose my medical license if I did. Not that it mattered to me, I'm done in that field for good. I was given an injection by the doctor. He told me that Brian's disease was not unfamiliar to them, and that it was extremely contagious, but only upon death. He explained that half the population is infected with a disease that keeps the brain conscious for hours, even days, following death. Brian's case was special in the sense that he actually retained some motor function and was able to speak to us. The injection given was not a cure. It'll only prevent me from spreading the disease, but once I die, I'll suffer a fate similar to Brian's. I just hope someone will stay with me when it happens.
Damn, dude.
That's fucked up. I mean, like, that's like a zombie type thing, you know, where they're only preventing you from making other zombies.
The idea that you're going to be sentient for an extra few hours after you die and be conscious while your body's decaying is like just so terrifying in a different way than I'm used to being terrified.
Yeah.
So
yeah, that was Decay by Richard Saxon.
I have to ask you, what made you read this one?
I was looking at a bunch of different stories and I saw this one, and it's just, I love, I don't know, zombies. And when I saw Decay, I was like, I have to read this one. I just have to. So yeah, I hope you folks enjoyed it. It was a lot longer than I thought it was going to be, which is funny because you thought that the story you read was going to be longer, but it was much shorter. But I like having stories that have a lot of dialogue.
Right. You're really good at reading dialogue. Like, every time you read dialogue, I'm like, I don't think I can read dialogue like she can.
Well, you know, growing up, one of my favorite things was reading out loud in class. Like, when we had to read stories in class, I was always like, I want to read. You know, and you've told the story of how you like
Popcorn.
Yeah, Popcorn Lee.
My favorite thing to do was actually not to just play Popcorn Lee. It was to have assigned roles. Where it's like, you read these lines, you read these lines.
Oh, yeah.
I loved doing that. And I had I was going to say professor. I had a teacher one year that let us do that for like everything we read. And she was just really mean to us one time about like everything that was happening in class because she was just upset in general. So me and another kid were like, hey, halfway through the story, let's change roles and see if anyone notices. And so it confused the shit out of everyone, but she wasn't paying any attention to what was happening in the class. And then we eventually switched back after like 10 minutes of doing that. But aside from that, I've always taken that very seriously. But you're really good at reading dialogue between two people talking to one another. So that really shines through when you read stuff like this.
Yeah, I really like reading stories. I like reading books. And when I read, that's why it takes me so long to finish a book. Because when I read the dialogue as every character has their own voice. Every character has their own personality. And that's just how I read. I don't know. That's
why I'm really excited for some of the books that I've read that are being turned into like TV shows and movies, because you always want to see like, do they sound like I thought they would sound? Do they look like I thought they would look? Do they behave the way I thought they would behave? So, either way, this is an excellent story. Good pick, Robin.
Thanks.
Golf clap. All right.
Golf clap to the actual author who wrote the story. Very good story.
Good job, Richard. Great job, in fact. So before we move into our next story, we are going to take a really quick commercial break. And we're back. All right, I'm going to get into my second story of the show, and this one is called Tantrum. It is a lot longer than my first one, and I haven't read it all the way through. I read like the first part. I was like, this sounds good. Then I skimmed it. Then I got to the end, and I was like, hell yes. I can't wait to discover this with everyone else because it sounds good, and I like the ending. But it goes like this. Let me just make something clear. I never get to go out somewhere nice, like ever. My best friend and I struggle to pay our bills every month, so anything fancier than McDonald's is usually out of the question. We'll save up for months to go on one of our, quote, roommate dates, so it's a really special treat. I've never been to the Lotus Bloom before, but it's one of those overpriced pop-ups around the city.
Sounds like a massage parlor or something.
The Lotus Bloom? Wow. It sounds like ice clinkling over there because Robin's drinking while I read. The Lotus Bloom before, but it's one of those overpriced pop-ups around the city that everyone has been raving about. We just barely got a reservation, and I was so excited to go. We basically had the menu memorized before we even arrived. But the second we were seated, I see this mother and her kid like 3 tables over. Honestly, it kind of shocked me given the price of the place. Of course, I was mostly just worried about the child throwing a temper tantrum and ruining the atmosphere. I mean, look, I'm not a huge kid person, but I don't mind them when they're well behaved, or at least in places they belong. I'm not going to give you the stink eye if your brat is screaming in the middle of a Chuck E. Cheese. But this is a nice place with no kids menu and a $40 per plate minimum. Like, who in their right mind takes a little kid here?
Rich people.
I tried not to look over, but Steph was obviously annoyed too. The girl looked about 6 or 7, so I thought maybe she was too old to throw a fit at a restaurant, but I didn't count on it. It was just a knee-jerk reaction, you know? I was on edge, anticipating having to deal with another parent who just didn't give a crap if their precious poopsie was bothering other guests. At any rate, it was relatively quiet so far. We ordered our food, and after chatting for a while, I pretty much forgot all about the kid. Then the screaming began. There was no warm-up. It went from upscale ambiance to a shrill, blood-curdling shriek. I would have thought the kid was being murdered, and I looked over reflexively. However, immediately after that ice pick to the skull, the kid was laughing at the top of her lungs as she ran back and forth down the aisle. The mother, for her part, didn't even seem to notice, totally detached, staring off into space. So we all have to deal with it while the mom just blocks it out. I looked around and saw that a few other people were just as annoyed, though none were staring as blatantly as I was. I tried to catch the mother's eye, but she was a million miles away. I waited to see if the waitstaff would do anything, but I figured they weren't allowed to intervene like that. I remember a news story years ago where parents were outraged by a restaurant putting up a sign asking parents to keep their kids behaved. I felt like getting up and yelling at the woman myself, but I didn't want to end up getting kicked out instead.
I think restaurants should have the right to say that.
I love our favorite movie theater to go before COVID hit was a place where you could buy beer and wine. It had reclining seats that you could sit in, which were amazing. And they would let you know, like, if your kids are disruptive, you will be asked to leave. Like, straight up. They're not being rude about it, but it's like, if your kid is upset for any reason, you can't calm them down, we're going to have to remove you. You will not get a refund because this place is specifically for people in an adult atmosphere to watch a movie. So we'd always go see our midnight shows there. So I totally understand, like, hey, sometimes people just want that kid-free experience, and sometimes it's parents that are on a date and they hired a babysitter and they don't want to go to a movie theater and hear someone else's kid cry when they could have just taken their kid in the first place. You know what I mean? So I totally understand where this place, or where this story is coming from. It continues. Now, before you get all mad at me, I'm not hating on the kid herself, just on the fact that this wasn't really the place for her. And honestly, it isn't the kids so much as the people raising them. Can't fault the child. So I tried really hard to just ignore the laughter. Obviously, it's better than screaming. Loud and a bit annoying, but whatever. I didn't want to let it ruin my night. Steph had this super irritated look on her face, and I knew she was thinking the same thing, but neither of us said anything. Our food arrived a few minutes later, and it looked even better than the pictures on the website. How often does that happen? For a second, I was too focused on my meal to stress over an unruly child. However, I barely had my fork in my hand when the little girl started shrieking again. I jerked my head over and saw the kid standing next to her table, staring right at her mother and screaming in rage. Again, the mother didn't respond, even when the little girl started knocking cups off the table. The tantrum escalated as the girl began pushing chairs over, but her mom sat there like nothing was happening. I couldn't believe she was that passive about her kid's behavior, and I tried to catch her gaze so she would know it. But that was when I noticed the mother's expression, like really noticed it. She wasn't just a little spaced out. It was like she couldn't hear the kid at all. In fact, her eyes were kind of glazed over, and for the first time, I saw how pale and exhausted she looked. Maybe that's normal for a parent with a difficult child, but this just seemed different. The sound of shattering glass made me jump, and I realized the girl had managed to break a plate.
I'm just wondering where this is going.
That was when a server finally approached, maybe the manager based on the attire. I was relieved and really hoped they just asked the woman to go. It was not hard to rubberneck, but I turned back to my plate. Maybe they'd leave without causing a scene. When the girl screamed again, it was like a shockwave through the restaurant. My water rattled, and Steph and I looked at each other. I heard a strange sound, and when I looked over, I noticed the manager was partially hunched over. His hand was on his mouth, and his eyes were closed. As his legs started to buckle, I noticed blood trickling out of his ear. He collapsed, and I could clearly see blood pouring from his mouth and nose, too.
This chick is evil. This kid has to be a
Most
monster.
of us stood up then. Some diners ran over to help, calling for someone to dial 911.
She's an SCP.
I noticed people around me with their phones out before I could even reach mine. But seconds later, the girl was screaming again, and all of the people who'd been trying to help the manager suddenly cried out in agony. Several of them fell over, and the ones who didn't were holding their heads. I noticed that they all had blood running from their ears, some of them from their noses, even their eyes. I stumbled back and knocked over my chair. Steph was up now too, and we inched away from the scene. The girl screamed again, and several of the patrons screamed with her as blood gushed from their mouths, eyes, and ears. The rest of them hit the ground then. Some of them had their eyes open, unblinking, dead-eyed like the mother. The little girl turned to face the rest of us, her face red with rage. I can't remember clearly what happened after that. I recall people screaming and pushing, rushing to the doors. Steph and I were just far enough back to avoid getting trampled as tables, chairs, and people alike were shoved out of the way. When the girl screamed again, all I could hear was ringing. I cringed and grabbed my ears. They were wet. For a moment,
Blood.
my vision swayed, and I thought I might pass out. Beside me, Steph had fallen to her knees. I gritted my teeth and grabbed her by the elbow, hurrying to the exits as fast as I could. But when I got there, I saw people freaking out, banging on the doors and windows, unable to open them.
What?
There were people at the emergency exit, people throwing chairs at the glass. The doors just weren't budging. My ears throbbed, but my hearing was starting to come back now. I looked over and saw the little girl crawling up to the level where all of us were huddled. Tables and chairs began to topple out of her way without her even touching them. My adrenaline was too high to really process what I was seeing. I just knew we had to get out of there. There were no other options, so I grabbed Steph and made her run for the back. I figured there had to be an exit through the kitchen, though I feared it would be blocked too. It was better than just standing there, either way. Once we reached the kitchen, however, I quickly realized I wasn't the only one with that idea. We met an aggressive crowd pushing through the small space in a frenzy. If we tried to push through, we'd probably be injured. When the girl screamed again, even from the other room, the pots on the stove exploded, covering people with boiling water. Some of the burners were still on, and the fire burst through the air, spreading over the panicked patrons. I froze, watching people burn alive before me until Steph grabbed my hand and pulled. Together we ran down the back hall. It was a dead end, but for the bathrooms. The handicapped restroom was the only one that was single stall, the only room that locked. We ran inside and secured it, then put our legs up against the door from that position to make it harder to open. Of course, putting pressure on the door won't stop it from being ripped off its hinges, and I get the feeling that our efforts are pointless. I tried 911 several times, but all I heard was a sharp, static kind of sound. The screaming outside the room was so loud, I felt like it was cutting through me. It went on for a long, long time. Steph and I have been in here now for a good half hour. The screams have gradually died down. It's gotten pretty quiet. We talked about checking to see what was happening, but I don't think it's such a good idea, especially not when it's so silent after all that. Even if people had managed to escape, it wouldn't be this still. I can hear steps, though, echoing down the hallway. Someone is heading our way, short, bouncy steps, skipping maybe. Steph is reaching for my hand. I guess I'm done typing. And that's how it ends.
So it's just this monster kid, and they just let her kill all these people?
I mean, how are you going to stop this kid? This kid's blowing everyone back and
Bullet through the head.
Wow. Oh yeah, they just take out the gun that they didn't have to shoot this
Snipe
child
through the window.
in the head.
People have had on the outside have had to see what was going on because people were pounding on the windows, right?
You don't know that.
So everyone outside
you don't know what
must
this
have
kid
been
can do.
calling,
This
like,
kid could be
911.
blacking out the windows and they can't see it.
You don't know.
You just think that there's a sniper waiting to take this kid out.
I
on
think
the
the
corner.
police could set up SWAT and a sniper in a on a roof across the way and just fucking snipe this kid through the window.
Okay, cool. So that's actually not that scary. Robin's telling y'all that this one's actually really easy to take care of. No one worried.
But-
We're very sure that this author was actually
Well,
okay.
and then the main character, right, is typing this while they're in the bathroom. This
Yeah,
whole
apparently they typed the
huge
entire
thing.
story of what happened to them while they're in the bathroom. As soon as the tense shifted, which is one of my least favorite things in writing, you're taught not to do it. It just is jarring. When you're doing past tense and you shift to present tense, it is very jarring. And they did that specifically in this story to make it seem like they had written this story while they were in the bathroom.
Because they're going to die now.
Yeah, because now they're documenting what happened, and who the hell knows how they found it. But yeah, I just thought this one was super intense, and when I was reading through, I was like, yep, this sounds good. And I know we have some folks that listen to our story, some we know personally who just are not into kids. And I was like, I feel like this is written by some of the folks that we know.
Who hate kids.
Who are just like, oh, this is my biggest fear. Like, I always think a kid is going to go all carry on everyone in a restaurant. But I thought this one was real fun. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you aren't as cynical as Robin, where it's just like, just fucking shoot the kid in the head. So, all right. Good stuff. Thank you.
I mean, there could be people that, like, bring in hazmat suit people to take this kid away, and you use her as a special project.
You
and
suddenly
test on
just
her.
think this kid is so easy to control. Like, she's just making people's ears explode and noses bleed and eyes bleed and fucking fire shooting through the air and boiling water shoot out of pots and shit just by screaming. Like,
they need another X-Men.
This is just the first thing that these people have noticed about this kid. So it feels very Stephen King to me, less Marvel. But whatever.
All right, I'm getting to the last story of this episode, and it was actually sent into us by one of our spooky friends for this particular podcast, which is scary-ish. If you didn't know, you're listening to us, you probably know.
You listened to 3 stories so far and didn't realize it.
But it does have a trigger warning. So if you have experienced like severe sleep paralysis or some traumatic experiences in your past, this is a trigger warning for that. So you can skip the story and skip all the way to the end where we talk about, you know, how you can contact us. Okay. This story goes. She was tired after her long and exhausting day of work. She was so exhausted that she just grabbed a slice of bread and shoved it in her mouth for her dinner and decided that she would shower after she got some sleep. Sleep was her only thought as she collapsed on her bed, still fully clothed, and she closed her eyes. It felt as if she'd only been asleep for 2 seconds when she was jerked wide awake by a shrieking, blood-curdling scream. She tried to push herself up from her bed, but only failed and found it was soaking wet and had a smell she couldn't quite place. Her eyes still closed, unable to open them from her exhaustion despite her panic from hearing the scream. She lay there, unable to breathe, trying to listen through the deafening silence for any other noises. Silence. That was all she heard. She continued to lay there, unmoving, seemingly wide awake, despite her eyes still being closed. She was, however, still aware of her soaked bed, now feeling more like it was made of cold jello. She again tried to push herself off her bed, still unable to move. Now she was confused. She'd heard of sleep paralysis before, but it would have worn off by now, surely, if that was in fact what she was experiencing. Certainly, she wasn't so exhausted that her body was choosing to fail her now. More panicked, she tried again to move. Just move, even a twitch of a finger. Still, nothing moved. She tried to scream. Nothing. She just realized that she was still holding her breath. Wait, when did she last take a breath? She remembered when. She last took a breath when she heard the scream and had awakened. Then she remembered the smell. No, she said to herself. Again and more frantic, she tried to move, tried to breathe, tried to scream. Again, nothing. She only felt the cold damp on her bed, and the edges of her cold jello were now beginning to lose the damp cold. She tried to remember the origin of the scream. Was it from a neighbor? Was it from the street? No, the scream was not from a neighbor, nor was it from a random location from the street. The scream had emitted itself from her home, from within her bedroom walls, from her now lifeless body left laying in her blood.
And the name of that
is Her Last,
which we were supposed to withhold until the end.
Yeah. So it's called Her Last by Annette. I totally, when it was like, when she heard the scream and then she couldn't move, I was like, she screamed. It was her scream, for sure. 100.
At first I was like, is she laying in her own blood? Did she pee herself?
Oh,
did she sweat? And then as it went on, I'm like, she's in her own blood.
I thought it was like, she sweated so much from, cause don't you sweat too when you experience like sleep paralysis and stuff like that?
I've never had sleep paralysis where I sweat a whole bunch, but I did wake up last night from a nightmare covered in sweat. So this like one really rang true to me when you were reading it. I was like,
towards the end, I was like, wait, she can't move her body. Did someone cut off her arms and legs and stuff like that? You know what I mean?
You get really weird when it comes to creepypasta, man.
It's fictional. You
I
can
didn't say it wasn't fictional. I just said you get really weird.
What's wrong with getting weird?
Shoot the little girl in the head.
Hashtag get weird.
Wow.
But no, yes. I just was thinking, my brain kind of, I guess, goes to the worst case scenario of what it could possibly be.
No shit.
But yeah, no, it was
I thought
good.
she was dead and she was laying in a pool of her own blood. Robin thought she was dead and had been dismembered.
Yeah, that's what because she couldn't move anything in her body, so I have to just
So
assume.
clearly all of her body parts have been cut apart and removed from her. So
It's just me, I guess.
Still, thank you so much for sending that in.
Yeah,
Annette.
thank
We
you
appreciate
so
it.
much. Also, you write really well. Good punctuation.
Indeed. So I want to thank everyone who wrote a short story anywhere ever, because it's a fun thing to do and it's also kind of scary. Shout out to Annette for sending in your short story, because sharing it is definitely something that is like the fear of every writer, and I think you did an excellent job.
Yep.
Shout out to everyone who has published anything on Creepypasta. We appreciate you as well.
Yeah.
You guys are all amazing. I really enjoyed the stories. Shout out to the folks who reached out to us and said, hey, here's a story I like. I wish you would read it. If any of you would like to suggest a topic, suggest an SCP, or send us your story, you can reach out to us by emailing pastatime@scarish.com. If you have an actual paranormal experience, true crime experience, spiritual, supernatural, anything like that, that has happened to you and you want to tell us about it, you can email our other email address, which is specifically for things that have actually happened. That one is storytime@scarish.com. We would love to hear from you. Regardless of what you want to talk to us about, you can hit us up on any of our social medias. Facebook is facebook.com/scarishpodcast. Twitter is @scarishpod, and Instagram is @scarishpodcast. Or you can go to our website, scarish.com, click on Contact Us, and fill out that form. It does come directly to us. Robin, for folks who would like to donate to us, how can they do so?
You can go to patreon.com/scarishpodcast. Those are monthly donations. Tiers start at $1. At $1, you get ad-free episodes, which are always great. And if you want there's other tiers that you can look at, like for physical merch, things like that. There's a tier where I actually send you something that I think is neat every month, or that I'm super into that month.
It's basically 50 Shades every month. So.
No, it's not. Shut up. And I think that's really fun for me. At least I get to shop for myself and other people. It's nice. And if you're not into the monthly tier type thing, monthly subscription, you can always go to coffee, ko-fi.com/scarishpodcast. Those are one-time donations. All your donations go to helping us upgrade our studio setup, kind of help us keep going, change things up. Like, our setup has changed so much from when we first started almost 4 years ago and to now. So it's pretty neat. Thank you so much, everyone.
Indeed. We appreciate all of your support. Thank you so much for listening, watching, and supporting us in all the ways you do. You people are amazing, and we absolutely love you. I say people, and I don't want to be discriminatory. All the ghosts that listen to as well.
No.
The cryptids. You folks are
yeah.
fantastic as well.
Mothman.
Thank you for...
Let's be besties.
Thank you for listening. So either way, thank you so much. And Robin, I think that's just about everything. So go ahead and sign us out.
Keep on creeping on. We'll talk to you folks later.
Bye-bye.